I'll concede your point just for brevity. But
What? Brevity? We don't do that around here. It's probably
No.
Citrus, or what is a Capital One Bowl? It used to be Citrus Bowl, right? Yeah,
oh my
Capital
God,
One.
dude, where have you been?
I just like the real name.
It hasn't been the Citrus Bowl since 2002?
What was your highlight side dish from Thanksgiving?
Oh gosh, Scotch.
This is the Buck Around, the podcast devoted to all things Wisconsin Badger football from a fan perspective. Featuring your hosts, Richard Branch and Maxwell Brusky.
And hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Buck Around. Welcome back to episode 316 of the Buck Around. I am one half of the Buck Around, Richard Branch, and the only half you're going to hear for the next minute or so as I intro this episode. We decided this week to cut the show into two pieces just because there's enough there. This one is going to be our USC preview with Connor Morrissette of USCfootball.com. We thought it kind of went long enough that it could stand on its own, and it was kind of an interesting discussion just because it's a new team into the conference. And for people who are just interested in the USC stuff, it's here in one piece and you don't have to go hunting and pecking around a larger episode. So hopefully that works for everybody. And we will have episode 317 dropping, maybe even later tonight if you're getting this on Tuesday afternoon. So you'll have one for the morning or whenever you want to listen to it. But that'll be a little bit more Badger focused, obviously. And ironically enough, because we've already recorded it, very Kirk Ferentz focused, as all great Wisconsin podcasts are. But without further ado, why don't I pass this off to myself, because that's who's going to talk next. There's no way to do this without it sounding awkward. So yeah, let's get to our interview with Connor. And we are now joined to discuss all things USC Trojans by Connor Morrissette of USCfootball.com. Connor, this is very weird to say. We can't wait to talk about a conference opponent, but here we are. Thank you so much for joining us to talk USC Trojans in the heart of Big Ten country.
My pleasure. It is weird, and I'll never get over Cal and Stanford in the ACC. That is bizarre.
Yeah.
Just as bizarre.
Yeah. Hey, so let's just get right into it. I think it's obviously worth saying USC had the number one overall draft pick last year. The dude lived up to, I think, his billing, it's fair to say. 30 touchdowns, 5 picks. I think he had another 10 rushing touchdowns or something crazy like that. Caleb Williams was there, but this team was very much short of expectations. It was 8-4, 8-5, I think, right? How does a team end up like that? What happened in 2024?
Well, when you start talking about the issues on the team, it has to start with the defensive side of the ball. Lincoln Riley in his first year, USC, it's safe to say, overachieved. They didn't have too tough of a schedule. The offense was really good. Jordan Addison played a huge role in USC, of course, Caleb Williams as well. And they make the Pac-12 championship game. Their defense was really bad, and everyone remembers that bowl game against Tulane where USC really should have won if they had a below-average defense, and the defense on that afternoon was pitiful, and USC loses a bowl game to a group of 5 opponent. And Lincoln Riley started to really feel the heat about his defense 2 years ago, but they had a solid season, and he earned the right to bring everyone back like he did on that side of the ball, coaching-wise, said we're going to rebuild in the transfer portal, things are going to get better, and then it just stayed exactly the same, even with the new additions. So defensively, that's a big part of why last year didn't go as a lot of people were hoping it would. I know I was really high on USC, and that didn't end up looking really good. The offensive line also wasn't very good. USC had Jonah Monheim play left tackle, and then every other position was sort of up and down. Caleb Williams was running for his life a lot. He felt like he had to be a hero. USC's receiver room, there was a lot of infighting there. The culture wasn't great. So it starts with the defense, but that wasn't the only issue. There were a lot of small things all throughout the year. And even when the team was 6-0 to begin the season, it was pretty clear that their days of winning were numbered. Arizona takes them to double or triple overtime at home, and Arizona ended up being really good, but that game was a big warning sign. Then they sneak by Cal later in the season, and Cal just wasn't a very good football team, even though they became bowl eligible. So overall, Lincoln Riley, he learned his lesson. He fired just about everyone on that defensive staff and clean slate this year, but there are still a lot of questions heading into year 3 of Lincoln Riley at USC.
Rich is smiling because he's thinking of Alex Grinch.
Yeah.
And I kind of agree with you too. I mean, they're like especially with Grinch too. I mean, he came in with, I don't want to say on a roll necessarily, but with a lot of, nobody thought that was going to happen. Put it that way. It seemed pretty solid. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but the big problem with him was he was trying to deploy the speed defense. And so people would just run over USC's defensive line. They wanted smaller guys who could get through offense, or maybe get between offensive linemen, instead of guys who would just bull rush and take on the offensive linemen. And it just was a style that did not work, and they could not stop the run. They weren't very good against the pass either, but that was really what did them in. That stylistically, what Alex Grinch wanted to do, it did not work. And I hope for your guys' sake that he learned some things, because it was not pretty last year. That's for sure.
He's safety's coach, I think. So he'll blend in with the Trestle and Fickle system rather than coordinate the thing himself. But I tend to agree with you. I want to talk, generally about offense. The things that you just mentioned, really, having the players for the style. I think one of the things that I've seen, and when kind of preparing for this and trying to find Connor to come on our program, is that so much of the news lately has been roster turnover, in the transfer portal with them. Is that how much different of a team is it this year from last year? And I mean, obviously you don't have Caleb Williams, but how much different of a team, just like how much can you project from last year to this year based on the personnel turnover?
What was so great about the end of last season was the Holiday Bowl gave USC fans a sneak peek of what this year's roster was going to look like. That's when the backup quarterback, Miller Moss, took over for Caleb Williams, who opted out. So I don't think we can expect Miller Moss to throw 6 touchdowns every game and light up the scoreboard every week. But that was reassuring after a really, really frustrating season for USC fans, seeing the backup quarterback come in, the guy who will be the starter this year in all likelihood, play really well and lead USC to a big win over Louisville. That helped. And then a lot of other guys who maybe didn't play a ton during the year really stepped up. USC has a really good group of sophomore wide receivers. Jacoby Lane didn't play a ton during the regular season. He catches 2 touchdowns in that Holiday Bowl game. Deuce Robinson played a little bit more than some of the other guys. He's a really talented receiver as well. He caught a touchdown in that Holiday Bowl game. The offensive line looked a little bit different. So that game really helped for USC fans to project out what this season will look like. But in terms of comparing the regular season group to the regular season group this year, it's very, very different. New quarterback. USC's left tackle is now moved to center, and he was the best offensive lineman on the roster last season, Jonah Monheim. The rest of the group, a couple other returners, but it's a lot of new players. USC is going to rely on a true freshman offensive tackle on the left side, and Elijah Page. The receiver group is new with younger players. Defensively, I think the secondary is going to be really good, and the linebackers are back, but they weren't particularly good last year, so you'll hope the new staff can improve with that. And then up front, defensively, a lot of question marks. Bear Alexander is really solid, of course, but after him, I don't really know who USC can totally rely on. Jamil Muhammad was a good edge rusher first 6 games last season, and then kind of fell off once the schedule got a lot tougher. So there are some guys returning, but all things considered, it's a lot of new faces and really a lot of question marks. That's why I'm so excited for the season. That first LSU game, we're going to get a lot of answers really quickly.
Yeah, you led me into something I was curious about. Obviously, Alex Grinch was not a fit person. His scheme and the personnel, like you said, kind of just didn't match. Guys are always going to say how great things are in spring. That's sort of the rap everywhere. No one loses a game. Everyone's undefeated in spring, and everybody's brilliant. But do you get a sense how the defense will look different? And are there guys maybe that we haven't really heard about that maybe have a shot to be more impactful this year than maybe what they were doing in the past?
Well, when you ask that question, I just think of the transfer portal, and USC brought in UCLA safety Kamari Ramsey, who follows Danton Lynn from UCLA. He's a guy who I covered in high school out here in Southern California. I think he's going to be an NFL player one day. So right away, that's a huge boost to a secondary that was up and down last season. And I think he'll have a huge role. USC also brought in John Humphrey, a cornerback from UCLA, who played a ton with Lynn last season. So I think you have to slot him in, although he was hurt at the end of the spring. So we'll see how healthy he is. Those two guys come to mind. In USC's spring game, they got a really, really solid performance from another cornerback, a transfer from Mississippi State who really excelled, and he had 2 interceptions in that game to Carlos Nicholson. So overall, I think last season at UCLA, D'Anton Lynn really relied on Leatu Latu and those really impressive defensive linemen to get pressure on the quarterback. And USC just doesn't have that personnel like UCLA did last year up front. So I think you're going to see a team that has a really, really strong secondary on the defensive side of the ball. I think the strength of that group will be the corners, will be the safeties. At linebacker, it really can't get much worse. You have to hope, because that was a real weak spot last season. Now you got the new coach, Matt Entz, who was a head coach at North Dakota State. Hopefully he can help develop some of those guys, because they are talented players in that linebacking room. They just didn't do what they needed to do last season. The big question mark is what happens up front. Bear Alexander in the middle, but at edge rusher, you have a lot of highly ranked recruits who maybe haven't performed at the level a lot of people expected in their college careers so far. So there's talent there, but if USC, for them to have a really good season, I think they're going to have to overachieve at the defensive line spot, and I'm not sure that they have the personnel to do that.
So it's Rich. It's another one of these things where I always talk about the defensive line.
Sounds like a similar story to Madison.
Yeah, it really does. And speaking of that, I'm looking over the roster. There's Tacky Curtis was a loss to Wisconsin, and I know he didn't kind of pan out the way that. And I don't know if he was one of those fit players that wasn't quite there. And I saw Bryson Shaw on the transfer list, who was a one-time Wisconsin recruit. So there's a little bit of crossover. So I kind of the same stuff with the offense too. I mean, what you want to kind of run through that and how that might look. And I'm looking at the schedule too, and there's teams like Michigan starts off right away, Wisconsin, Penn State. There's a lot of defenses in there. Wisconsin's defense will probably, we expect it'll be a little bit better than last year. It's not what it had been for the last couple of years, but Michigan and Penn State, I think, are going to be at the level they've been at the last couple of years. So how do you see that playing out?
Well, I feel as good as you possibly can about a quarterback who's only made one start in his career. Between Lincoln Riley, what he's done historically with quarterbacks, Miller Moss in the transfer portal era, choosing to stay and fight for his spot. His teammates love him for that. He's going to be a captain this year. He might not have the ability of a Caleb Williams. Clearly, not many quarterbacks do, but he's a talented guy. And if he can stay healthy, he's a little bit smaller, so he'll have to avoid getting hits. But he showed good mobility in the pocket against Louisville in the one game he did start. If he stays healthy, I think that will, of course, be huge. You want your starting quarterback to stay healthy, but I feel good about him. And it's kind of surprising to say that because he's so inexperienced, but he's just been around for so long. He was a highly ranked recruit. He's done all the right things off the field. Teammates love him. So I think at quarterback, even though there's some inexperience there, you have to feel pretty good. Last season, USC brought in a transfer from South Carolina at the running back spot, Marshawn Lloyd, plug and play kind of guy. He was electric, averaged over 7 yards per carry. He came from South Carolina, and this year USC is doing something similar at the running back spot. They brought in Jaquavius Woody Marks from Mississippi State, who a lot of draft people said, oh, maybe he could have potentially been drafted if he chose to go this year, but he wanted to go to USC and improve his stock. He's a great pass-catching back. After him, though, at running back, if he goes down, USC might be in some trouble, because then they have 2 redshirt freshmen and a true freshman, guys who just have really limited experience. So I think Woody Marks is going to have a huge role for this offense, and if he stays healthy, that'll be big. There's just not a lot of depth. You'll hear me continue to say that if this guy stays healthy, that they'll be okay. But if not, it's a question mark. The receivers, they have a super sophomore class. Some of the guys I mentioned earlier, Deuce Robinson, Jacoby Lane, people expect him to have a massive, massive sophomore season. Zachariah Branch did a lot of great things in the return game last year. He won whatever award that is as the best return guy in the country. It's time for him to take that step forward and show why he was a 5-star recruit as a wide receiver. He'll be a big play guy as well. And then Makai Lemon is another really talented receiver for USC. Those 4 sophomores are going to be the the big impact players in that group. And then they brought in a lot of experienced older transfers who will help supplement some of the depth there. Offensive line, like I said, Jonah Monheim goes from left tackle to center. Feel really good about him. He's just a really solid guy. Elijah Page, redshirt freshman left tackle. He's looked good in the spring, looked good in the Holiday Bowl, but very inexperienced. A few other guys are back on that line, but really those are the two notable players. The rest, it's sort of, okay, we'll see how well these guys do. Emmanuel Prignon transferred from Wyoming last season, and he had a solid year, but he was sort of up and down. If he can continue to be good at left guard, that'll help. But then two new guys will step in at those other spots. Is that everything? Am I forgetting any other positions? I think that's the full rundown. Oh, tight ends. Lincoln Riley doesn't really use his tight ends that much, so it would be a surprise if we saw a tight end breakout. They don't really have a great blocking tight end either, so we'll see. A lot of stuff needs to go better than I expected to for them to be really good. Let's just say that.
Okay. So you lead me into, it's sort of like a two-parter here, and these are almost related, but not quite. Number one, let's talk Lincoln Riley for a second. When I was prepping for this, the one thing that surprised me, last year their recruiting class was, I think, 18th in the 24/7 composite. That doesn't feel very USC-ish. Like, I think of USC as a top 10 team in terms of how it recruits. And even when you took out the transfer class and you just looked at the high school side, it wasn't significantly higher. Like, what's the feeling about Lincoln Riley right now amongst sort of USC fans, would you say?
It's a mixed bag. Some people after last season wanted him fired, which I think is too far. And then other people think he's the best coach of all time and he's going to turn this thing around. I can say this. When he first came here, he prioritized recruiting the transfer portal with NIL more so than the high school stuff. A lot of that was because it wasn't technically legal to negotiate with high school recruits, although, of course, other schools were doing that. And I was pushing them saying, hey, you're losing out on a lot of these guys because you're not playing the game that these other schools are playing. And they would just tell me, well, that's not allowed. We're going to go by the book. And fine. But that ultimately ended up costing them. And we see that with the 18th ranked recruiting class. I don't know how closely you guys have followed USC recruiting this past week, but they had 2 5-star defensive linemen from Georgia committed, and then one of them just flipped to Georgia, and then there was a decommitment. So they lost 2 of their best players on that side of the ball in that 2025 recruiting class. So I think the strategy to prioritize the transfer portal, I get it. When you're rebuilding a roster, you want to spend money on more proven commodities, but that hasn't really helped them in the high school game. And now they are beginning to negotiate with high school players, but they're just behind. And I did a hit with the 247 national show at the Elite 11 finals last week. And I just talked about how they've had some market misreads where they think they're giving a recruit a really good offer. And you talk to people involved in these recruitments, they're saying, well, that's not really competitive compared to what we're getting from some of these other schools. I think NIL is something that, not the whole story, but that's a big reason why USC hasn't been able to recruit at the level that a lot of people expect. A lot of USC fans are frustrated too. The Trojans haven't really prioritized kids in Southern California the way everyone talks about Pete Carroll. Pete Carroll, if a kid in Southern California was really good, he was going to USC no matter what. That hasn't really happened under Lincoln Riley. So it's a variety of factors. I think the defense being terrible doesn't help you, of course, too. You can give someone a lot of money, but if they don't think they're going to go to the NFL playing for you, they'll probably go somewhere else. NIL, I think, though, is bigger than a lot of people are talking about. And I say this, and then people say, oh, I wasn't aware that the situation was like that. And I get it. People don't like to talk about that stuff, but pretty soon we're going to get in the age of guaranteed contracts where a high school kid signs a 3-year deal that locks him in. He's not going to transfer, and then we can talk about the money. It's already happening. I think it's funny that a lot of recruiting people don't talk about that because that's one of the biggest factors that we have going today. And that's been a big emphasis for me reporting. How come USC, you'd think they'd get these top 10 classes? Why aren't they? NIL is a big part of it.
Interesting.
It really is interesting because, I mean, we have a lot of the same conversations, but, you know, nobody thinks as of Wisconsin as an NIL power. I mean, in basketball, you had, you know, they were massively outbid for AJ Storr, you know, who goes to Kansas. And I would think that USC would be on the cutting edge of that. And I think most people would think that, you know, from a national observation point, I would think they'd be on the cutting edge and knowing what they were doing. It's interesting.
You'd think that the school is extremely risk averse because they've had some pretty significant scandals, and that's trickled into the athletic department. I mean, the varsity blues thing, that was very embarrassing. But they've had a lot of other issues too at USC. So I think at the top it kind of was a risk aversion tactic. Like, hey, we maybe could get away with this, but we've had so many past transgressions. Let's just not do anything where we might get in trouble. But now that it's legal, they're sort of a step behind. And I think Lincoln Riley deserves some blame here because he doesn't want to be a fundraiser, but that's such a big part of it these days. You need to raise money to have a competitive team. And I think at times he's assigned that role to other people within the program, where if it was him, maybe that could have been better. USC has 3 collectives, an in-house NIL collective, and then 2 branded collectives that are sort of on the outside. And we hear a lot of players are negotiating, recruits are negotiating with these separate collectives, and it just doesn't feel like everyone's on the same page. And I think if Lincoln Riley got everyone in a room with athletic director Jen Cohen and they really hashed everything out, let's get on the same page, let's get these top recruits, let's really build something here, that would really help. But instead, that just hasn't happened. And then we see these 2 5-star decommitments, and the word out of USC is, oh, Lincoln Riley was surprised. He's really upset. Maybe this will cause him to change. We'll see. I just wonder why he wasn't doing some of these tactics a little bit sooner.
And you're kind of talking, NIL is obviously the big game changer that's going on, but the other one that's obviously as big is the thing we kind of were joking about at the start. USC is now a Big Ten team. And I just kind of wanted to wrap up with, how do USC fans feel? Like, what do you feel like is the median feeling? I mean, like, there's no, I think for us coming from the Big Ten perspective and the history, like, nobody really is angry at USC or UCLA. I mean, like, picking over the carcass, as it were, of the Pac-12 / well, I still want to call it the Pac-10 because I'm that old, but
better than the Pac-8.
Yes. Like, what is the tenor? Because for me, it's just kind of like, this is really weird to wrap my head around and nothing else. Like, not negative or positive. It's just that. And what do people feel like they're losing an identity? Or do they feel like they got a lifeboat off of a sinking ship? Or where are they at?
Yeah, I'd say lifeboat off of a sinking ship, probably. This was a move that had to be made. If you have the chance to join the SEC or the Big Ten, tradition be damned, I hate to say it, but that's the state of college sports. And so USC made a great move, partnering with UCLA. Shout out to the old athletic director, Mike Bone, who really did a lot of work behind the scenes to get USC into the Big Ten. Massive success, in my opinion, because if you stick behind, maybe USC would be in the Big 12, or I don't know. This was a move that needed to be made, and I'm upset that the Pac-12 is no more, and I think a lot of fans are too. But this was the state of college sports. This move needed to be done, and we're seeing tradition get thrown out the window all the time in college athletics. And nostalgia isn't a good reason to try to make things work. It's all about money in 2024, which is the unfortunate reality. So I think USC fans are excited. They were more excited when Oregon and Washington weren't going to join. Now that they're joining as well, that Lincoln Riley went on this big tirade talking about how, we didn't care if Washington and Oregon join. We're focused on USC. But let's not lie here. That was a big recruiting advantage that USC held over Oregon, a school that really has recruited against USC very well these last few years. So that advantage is now gone. But it's a really, really good opportunity for USC, of course. And I feel bad for Oregon State and Washington State. But I just remember covering that whole saga, and you'd hear people from Washington State and Oregon State be like, we're going to stay. Things are good. It's okay. And just so many people didn't have an idea of what was about to happen. And I feel like it was so easy to read the situation. And I feel for those schools, but that's just kind of the way it goes, I guess.
Well, Max and I always said they could take the other 8 former Pac-12 teams, bring them in, make them a Western Conference, and then you have an Eastern Conference of the Big Ten, and they could play a conference championship game on New Year's Day in Pasadena. Just an idea.
Yeah, that would be great. That what an original idea.
Anyways, Connor, you have been great. Thank you for coming on. You are our first one. Oh, Max has more.
We needed an unofficial prediction. And I say that, I'm looking at that schedule, and honestly, I don't know if you look at it, I don't think it's terrible. I mean, I think it's a pretty typical USC schedule as far as the strength goes. It's a little more travel, but I mean, it looks manageable to me. I don't know what your take is and how you see that playing out. And I think Rich just forgot our agenda. But that's okay.
Yeah, so tell us, Connor, what are you thinking?
It could definitely be worse. Missing Oregon and Ohio State, two of the teams picked right at the top of the Big Ten, is helpful, of course, from a USC perspective. But I just look at last year's schedule, and they played Nevada. They played Stanford early in the year when Stanford was terrible. They played Cal, who Cal probably should have beaten them, but that was a game everyone expected USC to win. The only game that I look at USC schedule and say, okay, that's a sure thing right now is probably Utah State. I don't think UCLA is going to be all that good, but the rivalry game, you can kind of, we'll see what happens. Minnesota, their over under isn't that high, but that's on the road. I just think it might not, the schedule this year, you might not have a ton of great opponents, but there are a lot of really good opponents. And if USC is inconsistent, then there's some teams on that schedule that USC might be favored against, but they could absolutely lose. So to me, I haven't made an official prediction, but I keep going back between 7-5 and 8-4. I just don't know about the depth of this roster, especially on that defensive line, offensive line. To me, it comes down to the trenches. If Miller Moss is protected by that line and USC can run the ball, good things will happen. If they can pressure the quarterback on defense, I think the linebacker play and the secondary play will be good and good enough to win games. But I just don't know who those players are that are going to step up and really make a big impact on the offensive and defensive line. So I'm nervous to pick USC to have some really great season, but I think 7-5, 8-4. To me, hang on to Julian Lewis, the 5-star quarterback in the 2025 class, and really build it up for 2025. Have some good momentum going into this upcoming season. I guess next season, I should say, because the last 2 years under Lincoln Riley, the team outside of the Holiday Bowl has kind of fallen on its face, losing the I think last 5 or 6 last season, the way it ended the first year in the bowl game, and then the Pac-12 championship where they couldn't stop anyone. If you can build some momentum, keep some recruits around in 2025, I could see 2 years from now USC having a better outlook. But for me, I don't think they're really going to be all that great. I just wonder about the Jimmies and the Joes a little bit. I think the coaching staff will be better, but I don't know if they have the players.
All right, don't kill me, but one more thing off of that is, Wisconsin's got a similar thing going on. It's the second year of Fickle. The first year was kind of nonplussed. Riley has, perennial playoff guy, and 7-5, 8-4. Does that make his seat start to get pretty hot? Because USC to me should be, especially in an expanded playoff team, like it's playoff or it's failure. And I would have said that even back then. I'm surprised that I'm sure you have a lot more thoughts and feelings on it, but I'm still amazed that the playoff, just getting into the playoff, hasn't happened more with USC since the format started. So 7-5, 8-4 seems to me like there'd be a lot of howling.
I think so too. I do think that even though Lincoln Riley has made some mistakes in his tenure so far, I just don't know how much of a better coach you can get. And I think you have to hope that he learns from his mistakes. Jim Harbaugh, totally different coach, but it wasn't always great at Michigan, of course, and the seat got hot for him. I think when you have one of these guys with the track records that Lincoln Riley has and Jim Harbaugh has, it's a little bit different, of course, but you just kind of have to ride with those guys, support them, and hope they figure it out. And I do think this year it could be a little dicey, but going forward, people love the new USC defensive line coach, Eric Henderson. He coached Aaron Donald on the Rams. Like, they do have some good stuff going for them on that defensive staff. Yeah. And I think they're feeling the pressure with NIL, and they're going to make some changes because they're going to have another recruiting class that won't be up to snuff and people will be frustrated. And I think they're going to answer to some of this criticism. So if you're a USC fan, you're probably frustrated with my prediction, and I totally get it. But I do feel like deep down, brighter days are ahead because you do have a good coach. The defensive staff should be better. Danton Lynn's a really hot commodity. I don't know how long he'll stick around. They have done some things right. It just might take more than one off season to really have that all come together. And if Miller Moss has a good year, but then sticks around, maybe you have him in 2 years from now, and then you're cooking with gas, a guy who's really experienced and will be in for one more year of college. You got the quarterback, you got some good skill position guys on offense. The defensive staff stays. That group takes us another jump. I could see USC being a lot better 2 years from now, but people won't want to hear that because it's all about right now. And 7-5, 8-4, like you talked about, that really isn't all that exciting.
All right, fair enough. Well, welcome to the Wisconsin ennui. We'll use it again for the second week in a row. That's what's going on with Badger fans right now. They're freaking out about these sort of 7-5, 8-4. So we've heard it. We know how they feel. Connor, this has been great. You gave us a ton of USC stuff, and again, it's so weird to look at a conference foe in Southern California, yet here we are. So thank you again for your time. It's Connor Morrissette, USCfootball.com. Anything else I should mention? I think that's all of it, right? You were pretty chill coming in. So thank you for coming on.
I think that's good. Yeah, my pleasure. I like what Wisconsin's done in the transfer portal. I did a story ranking some of the teams on USC's schedule who did well in the transfer portal. I like a lot of those guys, especially on defense.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it works. It's definitely a different look. For your listeners, we've talked about it quite a bit in the offseason that like you can see a different body type in terms of what they're after and what they're doing. So Max and I are, I think it's fair to say, speed and big long arms. Yeah, that's really what it is. It's guys who can cover a big area with their hands. But yeah, no, it's interesting stuff. So again, thanks, Connor. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, that was great. I hope everybody enjoyed Connor, because I thought he was a good kickoff to our big picture series for the summer. So look, just later this week, we'll have episode 317 up for you within the next 24 hours or so. Also, if you're curious to hear anything else from us, Rich did a appearance on the Power 5 Tailgate podcast, which I'm going to bury the lead here a little bit. You can find a link to on our YouTube page, which we're going to talk about in the next episode. But yeah, I did that. Also, you can find it in our social media feed, which is interesting to me because I mentioned in that show, I don't know how sold I am on USC, and I feel like talking to Connor, it's like, maybe there was something to that more than just a hunch. But at any rate, yeah, we'll be back soon. Thanks for listening. Thanks to all the USC people. If you're still hanging around and you want to add a college football podcast, come have a listen. We're here. There's plenty of room at the table for everybody. All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we will talk again soon. Bye-bye.
Enjoy the conversation? Head on over to buckaroundpodcast.com to find all the ways to connect with the show, links to our Patreon page, and feeds for every major podcasting platform. We want to thank each and every one of our patrons. You make this podcast possible. This has been The Buck Around, Badger football analysis from a fan perspective.